Good morning. It's good to see everybody here today. So glad we have something to be positive about. Waking up this morning to see snow on my car, I need something to be positive about. Welcome to spring in Montana. Yeah, we had just a little bit of a skiff of snow this morning, and that's okay. It waters the plants and everything else. But it's good to be here with you today. Our home gathering here in Kalispell, Montana, and we want to welcome all who will be viewing these online. Just a reminder to please subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends and family, and leave a comment, leave a thumbs up, and we would appreciate it very much. Our channel is growing and it's very exciting, and we're actually working on some things in the future to help and grow and spread it even more. So keep our program in your prayers if you're of a mind to, and hopefully we'll begin to reach even more people. This morning, I want to invite you, if you have your Bibles with you, open them up, and we'll be in Romans chapter 8. We are preparing the groundwork to move into 2 Corinthians 3 through 5, and I don't want to lose that notion that that's what we're doing and where we're heading. Excuse me. But what we're doing as we analyze these specific contexts is we're building the case of the continuity and the consistency and the cohesiveness of everything Paul is writing in all of his letters and his epistles. And we're showing how when we sit down with them together, look at his words, look at his expressions, the things that he writes, it helps us understand all of these separate contexts even more clearly, because Paul isn't talking about anything other than one thing. And that's where we began this series with back in number 1. I think where, as far as this series goes, we did take a little bit of a temporary halt last week during Mother's Day to honor our mothers, but I think this is number 19, I believe, in our series. And as we pointed out in the very beginning, Paul said there is one word that summarizes the entire story of the Bible, and that word is resurrection. And we have been seeing over and over and over the context that support that. 2 Corinthians 3 through 5 is another one of those contexts, just like Philippians 3 was, where we were a few weeks ago, looking at that context, Philippians 1 through 3. But the context of Romans chapter 8 is what a favorite term of mine that I used to use and invented. I think I invented it. I may have heard it from somebody else with the country background that I had, or they had one that was similar. Romans chapter 8 is a demonstration of Paul's doctrine of resurrection, stressing the importance of the corporate body view of resurrection out of a corporate body of death into a corporate body of life that we see transitioning in the New Testament period. In this last days period, we see this change from a body of death to a body of life. And it is so powerful, it is so potent, it is so direct, I like to say it's unget-overable. You can't get over the fact of what Paul is stressing, and that's what I want us to look at this morning, because it will help us as we transition towards 2 Corinthians to see that it's just another context building upon this theme that is never altered from. It is never changed. It is stressing that golden thread that begins in Genesis with death, the problem the Bible is focused on. And it follows that golden thread all the way to the closing of the New Testament document in Revelation chapter 21 and 22, where life is the solution. The challenge that interpreters of the Bible or readers, studiers of the Bible, those of us today here, those who see these things, anybody trying to make sense of the biblical doctrine of redemption and resurrection and salvation, is to not transport your mind or transport the biblical text into the days that you live, understanding there was an audience to whom these things were specifically written in a specific period of time, in a specific historical situation where there is a specific work of God being done to bring to an end, eschaton, to bring to an end His redemptive work. Anybody beyond that time is not the primary audience. We are, not in a bad sense, but we are and have been ever since, I believe, 70 AD, when the biblical text was finished, God's judgment took place, the resurrection happened, the second coming of Christ took place, all issues that we've covered so far and will continue to cover. From that time on, everybody reading and studying the text of Scripture is a secondary audience. Not in the sense of importance, but in the sense of we are now coming into a story that has changed drastically. We're coming into a story that's no longer an impart time. It's no longer a time where there is a covenant going out and a covenant coming in. Anything beyond the completion of God's redemptive work, there's just the covenant, the new covenant of Jesus Christ. It's finished. So a lot of the things that are happening in that last days period of time have come to a completion. And that influences a great deal of the New Testament that we read and attempt to apply to our lives. The simple illustration of this that I have of knowing the difference between the two audience and the four audience, I always take people to Matthew chapter 16. And in Matthew chapter 16 or in Mark chapter 8, we have Jesus talking to the disciples and asking them, who do people say that I am? And of course, they answered, you're one of the most important prophets. You're this person. You're that person. You're Elijah. You're this. You're whatever. You're an important, significant man. But then Jesus looks at them and says, "But who do you say that I am? You've been with me now all this time. Who do you say that I am?" Peter, as is normal for Peter, raises his hand and says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus pronounces a blessing upon him. "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father which is in heaven." Now, Peter, no, I have to die. Now that you understand beyond any shadow of doubt that I am God in the flesh, that I am the Son of God, the Messiah, that I have come to save mankind, I've got to die. And Peter says, "No, Lord, not you. You're not so. You're not going to." And Jesus looks at Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, adversary. You are not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of man." I've never met a Christian, myself included, that had trouble reading that text and saying, "Oh, that applied to Peter." Not to me. I'm not Satan. That was a specific comment directed at Peter. Simple illustration to understand there is a body of saints at Rome and Corinth and Galatia and Ephesus, Colossae, Philippi, Thessalonica, all of these cities. There are groups of believers primarily meeting in synagogues because they come out of that Israelite background. The Gentiles that are there, including people from the 10 northern tribes, as well as Greeks and heathens and pagans and others that are being influenced by the teachers of that day, are gathering and worshiping in all of these places. And Paul is dealing with a very specific set of goals that God has in a very specific time, in a very specific set of circumstances, and he is affecting this change from what had been God's covenant stance with the people for over 1,500 years. And now that covenant change is happening. There is a covenant on its way out being fulfilled. Why? Because according as we studied in the book of Hebrews, it could not the blood of bulls and goats and all that the old covenant represented could not take away sin. So it has to go. It has to be fulfilled. Jesus said, do not think I came to destroy it. I came to fulfill it. Till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law until all is fulfilled. Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18. So he is bringing fulfillment to the promises and hopes and expectations. Hebrews 9:15 said, the new covenant that he is bringing in would accomplish what this covenant going out could not accomplish, which was the redemption for those who lived under this covenant. All those who lived under this covenant need that new covenant to be fully established. The Bible is focused. The New Testament is focused on that period of time where every jot and tittle, every I dotted, every T crossed, could get to the point that Jesus could say, as he does in Revelation, I am the first and the last, the beginning and the end. It's finished. It's done. And Hebrews 10 could say, we now have access into the presence of the most holy place. We now can live and abide in it. John 14, Jesus promised when that would happen, the Father would come and live within us, make his home within us. Restoration back to the Father. Okay. In Romans chapter 8, we introduced the first 11 verses of that a couple of weeks ago. But it is clear what Paul is dealing with. Resurrection is the absolute focus, without exception, of the Roman epistle. Paul is dealing with it everywhere. He's making the argument that the old covenant could not do. It did exactly what God intended for it to do in chapter 3, 19 and following. Stop every mouth, make all confront their guilt before God, and demonstrate that righteousness could never be by law, but the law and the prophets would also testify that righteousness would come by the faith of Christ in verse 22 of chapter 3. He uses the illustration of Abraham in chapter 4. Abraham was justified in God's sight when God was able to look at Abraham's mind and Abraham's heart and see that he trusted God implicitly, beyond human control. Not when he obeyed perfectly, not when he carried out certain commands perfectly and to the letter, but when God looked at his heart and knew what he was submitting to. In chapter 5, that emphasis is stressed about the first Adam and the second Adam and the contrast. The first Adam brings the sin by which all men are separated. Jesus Christ, the second Adam, the second corporate head, brings in the redemption from that sin. And these people in that first century time frame, according to Romans chapter 6, are being buried with him into the purposes of his baptism so that they could share in a resurrection like his. They were not baptized into a literal crucifixion, but they were baptized into his death, the purpose of his death. It is the nature of the death that they had already experienced that would determine the nature of the resurrection. The death that they had participated in was not physical death, but it was death to the world of the law. And so now in their waiting, they are waiting for the fulfillment of that resurrection. In chapter 7, Paul stresses again, the law that I thought would bring life, he said, pointed out my death. It was holy and just and good because it did what God intended for it to do. But I thought I could live according to the law and prove my righteousness to God, Paul said. But I couldn't do that. I did exactly the opposite. Therefore, he would say, O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from the body of this death? Paul wanted out of that corporate body that he has been dealing with in the first 7 chapters. That corporate body identified by the law of Moses, that body of death, the body that the federal head was the first Adam, who thought righteousness and relationship with God could be by human capabilities. And so Paul wants out of that body of death. And he thanks God through Jesus Christ our Lord. Then he goes on and says, there's no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus, who do not walk according to flesh, but according to the Spirit. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has made me free from the law of the sin and the death. And he goes on and stresses that. And in verse 9, but you are not in flesh, but in spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. You see, this is where I said this unget-overable stress of Paul has nothing to do with biological life versus life beyond biological life. It has nothing to do with physical death and existence beyond physical death. He is stressing two modes of existence, two covenant worlds. One is a body of death that Paul wants out of. The other is the ongoing fulfillment of the body of life that Paul wants into fully. But you are not in flesh, really? This is where we have to understand how ridiculous it is to literalize these terms in our present understanding. Paul is writing to the church at Rome, all of whom who are alive biologically are very much in fleshly bodies, biological bodies. But Paul said to these people in his theological emphasis, you're not in flesh. You see, for Paul, being not in flesh is being in a mode of existence determined by that old covenant world. Because for Paul, as we've stressed over and over, life in the flesh is life by human capability observing the law perfectly. That's what Paul means. That's what he stresses over and over. You're in the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you, or God's Spirit literally dwells in you. Now, if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he is not his. And if Christ is in you, the body is dead. You see, there is already an effect that they are taking part, that they are taking part in this transition, and literally they are affecting this transition. By coming into the body of Christ, by being baptized into the purpose of the death of Christ in that first century time frame, they are also waiting for the purpose of the resurrection of Christ to be fully given to them. It isn't finished yet, but they are affecting this transition and this change. And if Christ is in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the Spirit is life because of righteousness. You can't literalize it. This is unget-overable. You can't literalize it and make it about fleshly bodies, biological bodies. If so, then they're all dead, but they're not. But the body, that corporate body identified by the law and the covenant of Moses, is being brought to a death and completion. But if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you. You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of Jesus in John 7:38 when he promised that if you believe on me, out of your heart will flow rivers of living water. Jesus made that promise, that they would become in themselves a source of life. So now he's telling them, by checking out of and fully being released from the body of this death, even in your mortal bodies, even in your mortal lives, even in your daily existence, you can become the means of becoming and being a river of life to those who see you. Paul means what he says. He goes on and he says in verse 12, this is where we get to in transitioning and moving on. Therefore, brethren, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. Can we literalize it? Can we make it biological existence? Can we say that Paul gives no concern for food, for nourishment, for life, for health, or any of those things? No, he's not saying that at all. For if you live, watch this verse. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. Now, to literalize this, it makes one kind of want to look at what Paul says and say, well, duh. Yeah. if you live in a fleshly body, we're all going to die. That's been the story of humanity for the last 2,000 years, and it will continue to be. But that's not exactly what the text says. What the text does say literally, for if you live according to the Spirit or according to the flesh, what it originally said, using the Greek form of melo, it's melate, you are about to die. For if you live according to the flesh, literally, you are about to die. Paul is warning them that this life of the flesh, tied to this old covenant that's on its way out, is about to end. And when it dies, if everything you account in life spiritually, theologically, by faith, if your faith is in that system, the fleshly system of the law, when it dies, you will die with it. But then notice what he goes on to say. But if by the Spirit, this covenant coming in, those two worlds contrasted, but if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. Do you remember what Jesus said in John 5:24? Believing on him and him who sent him passes one from death into life, and you shall not come into judgment. John 8:51, the same thing. You will never taste death. Folks, to try to go into these contexts and say, well, yeah, that one has to be spiritual, but over here, this has to be physical, only happens when we bring to the text a preconceived idea that resurrection is about physical bodies out of physical graves and out of the dirt of the ground at the end of time. Because of what we've been taught, the preconceived notions, the presuppositions that we bring to the text. But if we stay with the consistency of the text, there is one death identified, separation from God, Genesis 2 and Genesis 3. There is one life solution identified to it, which overcomes that separation, brings us back into covenant relationship, full covenant fellowship with God through the finished work of Jesus Christ. That's the story of death to life in Scripture. He says, for as many as are led, verse 14 of chapter 8, for as many as are led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons of God. For you did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. This spirit of bondage again to fear reminds me of Hebrews chapter 12, where he compares the two mountains. Mount Sinai, the old covenant, with Mount Zion, the new covenant, the home of the heavenly Jerusalem. What was the characteristic of that old Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb in Sinai? What was the characteristic of it? If anything, even an animal touches it, it's to be put to death, and they tremble. Moses didn't want to go on, didn't want to go up it. But they were fearful, shaking, constantly fearful of what that mountain represented, because God was unapproachable. You couldn't come with boldness into the presence of God on that mountain. But he says, you have come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, the church of the firstborn. After he had already said in chapter 10, when that happens, you can come with boldness into the very presence of God. You see, this mountain and this covenant is not a covenant of fear. You have received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. There's nothing more touching than to see videos of small children that have not had a home and have been shuffled from one foster home to another, to finally realize in court that they are being adopted and brought into a family that loves them. Nothing brings tears to my eyes more than videos like that, to see these little children and the joy that they feel because they now know I am part of this family. It's really touching. And that's what he's talking about here. You did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. The most intimate expression of the relationship we have with a father. It's like a small child's reference to their father as daddy. How important that is. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, joint heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. That takes us right back to chapter 6, verse 4. Therefore, we were buried with him through the baptism into the death. Folks, I don't mean to shake up anybody, because I used to believe this was so relevant to me. You and I cannot be baptized with Jesus into the death that this baptism is meant to overcome, because the death is identified and quantified and related to the law. Therefore, we were buried with him through the baptism into the death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. For if we have been united together in the likeness of his death, if we have been united together in a death like his, certainly we shall also be in a resurrection like his. Knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him, that the body of the sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves of the sin. He goes on and stresses that over and over. These people are participating with Jesus in the overthrow of the sin, leading to the death, so that they could come into the glory of the fulfilled new covenant. That's what he's going to go on and talk about now in verse 18 and following. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time, not our time. Paul makes this clear. Of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory, which is, again, the Greek term mello and the forms of mello. Never an exception. Always carry the weight of about to be. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which is about to be revealed in us. It's the Greek term meluson, the participial phrase, it is about to be revealed in us. Not 2,000 years down the road and counting, but now. This present time, Paul says, it's about to be. That makes such wonderful sense. It agrees with chapter 13, verse 11, and do this, knowing the time. What time? The present time. Do this knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. For you and me today, to apply this to you and me today, as the to audience, not the for audience, but the to audience, to personalize it as if it's written to us, you must also accept the fact that your salvation is as yet incomplete. For now is our salvation nearer than when we first believed. We're still in some sort of holding and waiting process, waiting for salvation. 2,000 years and counting, and we still don't have it. It's not complete. For now is our salvation nearer than when we first believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Therefore, let us cast off the works of darkness. Paul makes this transition, this already but not yet, that I've talked about and stressed so many times in this series. Paul makes this very clear. For the earnest expectation, I want you over these next several verses to note a word. For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now. Not only that, but we also, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body. Now, as Paul has just stressed in that last verse, eagerly we ourselves, plural, we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body, singular. He's stressing the corporate body transition. But who is and what is this creation that he stresses 4 times, 5 times? You see, those who literalize this text, and these teachings are left with the unenviable job of defending that creation is the rocks and the trees and the reels and the rivers and all of those things that have to be delivered. And delivered into what? That they might become part of the liberty or the children of God. But that's not the creation Paul has in mind. The creation that Paul has in mind, that he's stressing for the earnest expectation of the creation, is the creation that he's been talking about since chapter 1. Go with me back to chapter 4 real quickly. In chapter 4, chapter 4, quickly, verse 16, when he has just made the example of Abraham and what Abraham found according to faith, his faith in God, his faith in what Christ ultimately would fulfill, not by his own ability under the law. It says in verse 16 of chapter 4, therefore it is of faith that it might be according to grace, so that the promise might be sure to all the seed, not only to those who are of the law, Israel, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham. Any who would come from that point on, the 4 audience, who would share a faith like Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made, who? God. I have made you a father of many nations in the presence of him whom he believed, God, who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did, who contrary to hope and hope believes, so that he became the father of many nations. According to what was spoken, so shall your descendants be. And not being weak in faith, he did not consider his own body already dead, since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb already dead. He did not waver at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully convinced that what he was promised, he was able to perform, and therefore it was accounted to him for righteousness. So what did God create? God created through Abraham the father. He became the father of many nations. And God stepped into deadness and brought absolute life out of that deadness. The deadness of Abraham's body, the deadness of Sarah's womb. God stepped into what just as he did with Elizabeth, what man says is impossible, as we looked at on Mother's Day, who was way beyond childbearing years. What man says is impossible, with God all things are possible. The same with the rich young ruler. You see, the Bible is filled with nothing but a story of death that leads to life through the work of God, starting, carried through, and finished. It's resurrection. Right back to where we started. Paul said, concerning resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. The Israelites of his day saw it as an attack on the people, the law, and the place. Those 3 things. You see, they understood Paul's teaching on resurrection was a complete removal of what those 3 things represented, the covenant of Moses. It was the fulfillment of it. They didn't understand that. They just saw it as an attack on it. Jesus says, I came to fulfill those 3 things. And in doing that, I will seek and save the lost, Luke 19:10. Man, it's such a beautiful, consistent story. God brings resurrection out of death. And through that, he made a special creation. What was that creation? Israel. Israel is the creation of God. Israel is the creation longing for deliverance. And notice what Paul writes in chapter 15, verse 8. Now I say that Jesus Christ has become a servant to the circumcision for the truth of God, to confirm the promises made to the fathers, and coordinating conjunction, linking the two, and that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy. There is a 2 audience experiencing all of this development, but it is for all humanity to be able to share in the faith of Abraham that brings us into the mighty presence of God. that takes care of our separation from God at a covenantal level. That creation was subjected to futility. Isn't that interesting? Nature, trees, rocks, everything in nature is not subjected to futility. Nature is doing exactly what God designed nature to do. So what is this creation? It's Israel. Why is it subjected to futility? Because in chapter 7, Paul says, God gave a law that I thought would bring life, but it only brought death. More literally, it pointed out my death. It pointed out my separation from God. So he subjected them to 1,500 years of futility. He might as well said, go ahead, build a temple, build it exactly as I specified. Then every one of you, if you want to make it to heaven, you got to go pick it up and lift it over your head. Just that futile. Life under the law, attempting to achieve righteousness by that life, is nothing short of futility. And yet so much of Christianity over the last 2,000 years has tried to subject us to a better law. There is no better law than one that is holy and just and good. There is no other law needed to prove to us that righteousness can never be by law. God gave the law of Moses to demonstrate that reality so that we would do what? So that we would know beyond any shadow of doubt that there has to be another way. And that's what Paul's dealing with. He's dealing with the revealing of that way, and that way is the faith of Christ. The faith of Jesus, who did on behalf of mankind what only he could do. Going on. Verse 23, not only that, but we also who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body. We're not waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body, folks. We don't need to wait for a body out of the ground or out of the ocean or anywhere that it might have died or got spread or anything else. Because you and I are part of the body that Paul was waiting, and they were waiting for the redemption of it. The same body that he's been dealing with. And if Christ is in you, the body is dead. That old body is dead. But the Spirit of life, because of righteousness, that new body, it's working toward the fulfillment and the finishing of that. Ephesians 2 and 3 describes it as a house. God's building a house. Jesus is the cornerstone. The apostles and prophets are the foundation. The church is being built together as a spiritual habitation for God through the ages. Is God really that slow of a builder? The 2,000 years and counting, he hasn't finished his house? The end is about the finishing of the building of that process. And then what? Ephesians 3 said that the glory of God would be revealed throughout the church through the ages, world without end. You and I are given the ability to come into and live in the house that was finished. Eschatology. When the last things that were done, needed to be done, were finished. It's finished. That's Revelation 21 and 22. John says, I looked up and I saw the new heaven and new earth, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God to be with men. And what's now? Inviting them all to come into it. God's on the throne in the middle of it. The Lamb is its light. The river of life for the healing, for those who would thirst. The tree of life for the healing of the nations. All finished. You and I need to live in that place. For we were saved in this hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. For why does one still hope for what he sees? You see, there's the terrible, terrible consequence of making this just keep going on and on and on. We just live in a perpetual state of hope. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, Proverbs 13:12. But when it comes, it's a tree of life. Resurrection. Even the proverb writer knew it. Hope that's carried on perpetually forever and ever and ever is nothing but a disturbing idea. It makes the heart sick. But when it comes, and that's what Paul's dealing with, it's a tree of life. But if we hope for what we do not have or do not see, we eagerly wait for it with perseverance. Likewise, the Spirit also helps our weaknesses. For we do not know what we should pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself makes intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. Now he who searches the hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because he makes intercession for the saints according to the will of God. What does that mean? Does that mean God's up there interpreting our frustrations, or the Spirit is up there interpreting our frustrations to God? That isn't what that means. It means exactly what Jesus promised in John chapter 14 through 16. I've got to go away, and it's beneficial if I go away, because if I do, the Spirit, the Comforter, will come. He will guide you into all truth. He will tell you of things to come. He will bring to your remembrance all things that I have taught you. But even more specifically, in John chapter 16, verses 13 and 15 through 15, he says he will take of my things and give them to you and finish them with you. They weren't sure. Paul perhaps is not even totally sure. They weren't sure of everything that had to take place to get this finished. So the Spirit in this context is not expressing things to God that we don't have the human capability to express. That's a nice thought. It's a comforting thought. But in the specifics of this day and time, the Spirit is doing the work and finishing the work of Jesus, expressing everything through the apostles and the prophets who are writing it down so that perfect understanding can come. That's Ephesians 3, 1 through 5. God authors it. Jesus comes as the sacrifice. He sends the Spirit, the Comforter, who chooses holy apostles and prophets who write it down, howbeit when we read, we might understand. That's the Spirit making intercession. The Spirit's work in the first century is enabling Paul to say, I fill up in my flesh what's lacking in the afflictions of Christ. They may not have known what to ask for, but the Spirit knew what to do because he was finishing the things of Christ. And we know that all things work together for good, quickly coming to a close. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose, for whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he predestined, these he also called. Whom he called, these he also justified. Whom he justified, these he also glorified. Folks, that's not you and me. Many believe today that this idea of election and predestination is going on down through time, that God is looking down saying, saved, lost, saved, lost, saved, lost. Even before birth, that person will be saved, that person will be lost. That person will do this, that person will do that. They don't have really any choice in it. It's the greatest difficulty that the doctrine of Calvinism has to be able to try to justify. But when we stay in this context, there is clearly a time, there is clearly a generation, there is clearly a creation that God foreknew, that he predestined them to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he predestined them, he called them elect, he called them justified, and he is working through that predestined elect group and creation and generation to bring about the finishing of glorification and justification. They were the elect. They were the predestined ones. We need to let them do what God foreknew they could do and would do. And that takes us back to 1 Peter chapter 2, or 1 Peter chapter 1. We stressed this many lessons ago. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his abundant mercy has begotten us again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. That us audience that he's writing to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, and that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you, who are kept by the power of God through faith for salvation, ready to be revealed, literally about to be revealed. Same story. In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials. Who? That predestined elect generation that God foreknew when he would accomplish this. That the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. What would happen then? Whom, having not seen, you love, though now you do not see him, yet believing you rejoice with joy inexpressible, full of glory, receiving the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls. When? At his revelation. And then Peter goes on to express the salvation that the prophets foretold was for them, the people that Peter is writing to, that us, not us today here in Kalispell, Montana. They knew they weren't writing for their own time, but they were writing for that elect, predestined generation that God foreknew. When that creation that he had made, crying out, wanting to be adopted, wanting to be brought fully into it, would receive that adoption. And then in chapter 2, verse 9, he says, but you, to the pilgrims of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia. I don't think any of those are Montana counties. But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Doesn't that sound like Israel brought out of an old covenant of death into a marvelous covenant of life? Doesn't that sound like that generation that's demonstrating and affecting that change? That sounds exactly like that. Who once were not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. They didn't obtain mercy. They didn't obtain the finished redemptive plan of God through the old covenant. But these Israelites, these Hebrews, these Jews who are coming out of that covenant, that wretched covenant body of death, into this beautiful, fulfilled body of life. They're affecting that change. They're living in that time. They're the royal priesthood. What does a priest do? A priest serves on behalf of the people. This chosen generation, this predestined, elect generation whom God foreknew, are priests serving humanity. Serving all of humanity. Serving you and me today. Wouldn't they be disappointed in that great cloud of witnesses that they're part of to look down on believers today saying, man, I wish someday I'd finally get salvation. Man, I wish God would finish this plan. Man, I wish Jesus would come again. Maranatha, Lord, come quickly. Wouldn't they be so disappointed to say, have you completely missed what we as priests gave you and brought to you? So that's the beauty of this. I want to invite you to think seriously about these things. Next week, I promise, 2 Corinthians 3-5, we're going to continue to see what this tabernacle of God, this temple of God, this habitation of God, what it looks like, and how consistently what Paul says, it's about the transition of covenant worlds. And we have the ability to look historically, almost 2,000 years ago, to that generation, that elect predestined generation that is bringing about and showing us the full outworking and meaning of what the covenant of life is that you and I have the blessing to live into in the presence of God. Blessings throughout your week. We'll see you next week.